A story about a man who had one night, one fence, and nothing left to lose until two strangers arrived carrying a storm he never saw coming. When the most powerful land company in the territory came to take the last thing he owned, he stood his ground. And what happened next changed Redstone Valley forever. If you stay until the very end, you'll witness a stand that nobody saw coming. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The sun was dying angry over Redstone Valley, and Eli Hargrove had seen enough of its kind to know this one meant business. Red light bled across the western ridge like a wound that wouldn't close, painting the drought-cracked earth in shades of rust and old blood. The sky looked the way a man's face looks right before he throws a punch, flushed and tight, and absolutely certain of what comes next. Eli stood at the center of his failing land with a hammer in one hand and a rotted fence post in the other, and he felt the weight of 3 years pressing down on him like a stone slab. Not the weight of work, the weight of ruin. There was a difference, and a man learned it the hard way. The fence was falling, not sagging, not leaning at a gentleman's angle the way old fences do when they have earned their rest. Falling, 70 yards of barbed wire and split timber collapsing into the dust, like a drunk surrendering to gravity, section by section, as if the very ground had decided it was done holding anything up. It ran along the eastern boundary of his property, 160 acres of dead grass and cracked soil that had once been the finest cattle land in the valley. The fence was the only thing standing between what remained of the Hargrove family claim and the sprawling ambitions of the Irongate Land Company. And the Irongate Land Company did not believe in boundaries. Eli dropped the rotted post and pressed the back of his wrist against his forehead. His hands were a map of hard years, scarred and calloused, the kind of hands that had built things and broken things and buried things. He was 34 years old and he looked 45. The drought did that to a man. Carved the years into his face like erosion working through stone, relentless, impatient, and completely indifferent to what you'd been before. He'd been out here since before sunrise, 16 hours of swinging, digging, cursing at earth, that had gone hard as iron baked solid in 3 years of merciless sun. His shirt was soaked through, his boots were caked in dust, so thick it looked like dried blood. The blisters on his palms had long since burst and dried and started bleeding again. He lifted the post hole digger and drove it into the ground. The impact jarred his shoulders hard enough to rattle his back teeth. "You're going to kill yourself out here, Hargrove." The voice came from behind him, raspy, familiar, and about as welcome as a rattlesnake in a bedroll. Eli didn't turn around. "Go home, Fen." "Can't do that." Footsteps crunched through the brittle grass. "Got a message for you." "Not interested." "Irongate's interested. That's what matters now." Eli set down the digger and turned slowly. Dutch Fen stood 10 feet back, a wiry man in his 50s, with a face like a hatchet blade, and eyes that never quite managed to meet yours straight on. He wore a linen coat despite the heat and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who delivered bad news for a living. The Irongate Land Company called him a land agent. Everyone else in Redstone Valley called him something that couldn't be repeated in polite company. "They're giving you until tomorrow night," Fen said. "After that, they're calling the note." Eli's jaw tightened. "I've got time on that note." "Had time. Past tense." Fen pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out between two fingers the way you would offer something to a dog you weren't quite sure of. "Bank sold your debt to Irongate 3 days ago. Legal and proper. They own the note now and they're done waiting." The paper hung between them in the dead air. Eli looked at it without moving. "You can't do that," he said quietly. "Already done." Fen's voice carried no sympathy and no malice either, just the flat professional tone of a man who had delivered this particular speech so many times it had worn smooth as river rock. "Sign the transfer tomorrow. They'll give you $100 and safe passage out of the valley. Refuse and they'll foreclose. Either way, this land stops being yours in 24 hours. This land's been in my family for 3 generations." "I know." Fen tucked the paper back inside his coat. "Doesn't matter. Drought killed it. Irongate's buying it. That's how it works now." "I can still make it pay." Fen looked at him with something almost like pity, the kind that's worse than contempt, because at least contempt treats you like an equal. "With what?" "You've got no water, no stock, no capital." He gestured at the sagging fence line with a lazy hand. "That fence there, that's not a fence, Hargrove. That's a tombstone. Eli's hand tightened on the hammer handle. He felt the grip of it, the solidity, the weight of it in his palm. Fenn noticed. His expression didn't change, but his weight shifted just slightly, just enough. "Don't be stupid," he said softly. "You swing that you'll hang, and Irongate will still take your land." The moment stretched out long and thin. The wind picked up, hot and purposeless, skimming dust devils across the dead fields. A crow called from somewhere Eli couldn't see. He stood there with the hammer in his hand and 3 years of loss pressing at his chest, and he thought about his father, and he thought about his grandfather, and he thought about the day the creek had finally stopped running. He lowered the hammer. Fenn nodded, satisfied in the way only messengers can be satisfied, the satisfaction of a man who has done his part and will sleep fine regardless of what you do next. "Smart. I'll be back tomorrow at sundown. Have an answer ready." He turned and walked back toward the road where his horse stood tied to a dead cottonwood. Eli watched him go, every muscle in his body coiled tight as new wire. When Fenn disappeared around the bend, Eli turned back to the fence, lifted the hammer over his head, and threw it. It sailed 30 feet through the dying light and struck a fence post with a crack that rang out across the empty valley like a gunshot. Then silence. Just the wind and the shrinking daylight and the sound of Eli Hargrove breathing. He picked up the post hole digger and went back to work. Not because he thought he could finish. There was no finishing this, not alone, not in one night. But stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing what Dutch Fenn had just confirmed in plain language. He was out of time. The fence stretched before him like an accusation, 70 yards, 43, posts, 6 rolls of wire, most of it rotten or rusted through. He'd need 3 strong men and a full week to do it properly. He had himself in maybe 10 hours. He drove the digger into the iron earth and leaned his whole weight into it. He was halfway through the 3rd new post when he heard them. Footsteps, soft, hesitant, coming from the direction of the road. 2 sets of them, moving slowly. Eli straightened his hand, moving without conscious thought to the rifle leaning against the fence 20 feet to his left. Out here after dark, unannounced visitors didn't mean anything good. They never had, not in 3 years of drought and desperation and men coming to pick at what remained. "Don't shoot." The voice was female, young, a little scared but holding steady. "We're not armed. We need help." 2 shapes materialized from the gloom, moving with their hands visible and their pace deliberate, the careful body language of people who understood they were approaching a frightened animal and didn't want to spook it. They stepped into the pale moonlight and Eli's breath caught. Identical. Not just similar the way sisters sometimes are, not the echo resemblance of shared blood. Identical. Same height, same dark hair pulled back from their faces. Same bone structure, same curve of jaw, same way of holding their heads, slightly tilted. Even in the poor light, the resemblance was unsettling, like looking at one person reflected in 2 mirrors placed at different angles. Twins. They stopped 15 feet away. Up close, he could see the differences, small ones, the kind that required attention to notice. The one on the left had softer eyes. Something in them still held a quality he had almost forgotten existed in this valley, something like hope. The one on the right stood straight, her shoulders squared, jaw set at an angle that said she'd already decided this conversation was going to go her way, regardless of what he thought about it. "We saw your light," the softer one said, "from the road. We've been walking since yesterday." The other one cut in, her voice a different instrument, entirely harder with edges. "We need water and shelter for the night. We can work for it." Eli studied them both for a long moment. Their clothes were caked in dust. Their boots were worn down in a way that told the story of serious distance. Whatever they'd been walking from, they'd been walking hard. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "North Settlement," the harder one said. "Dumbo. That settlement burned out 2 months ago. We know, we stayed after. Tried to make it work." Her eyes moved briefly to the collapsing fence line, then back to him. "Didn't." There was a story in the space between those 2 words. He could feel the shape of it without knowing its details. The way they stood apart from each other, a careful 1.5 feet of distance that might as well have been a canyon. The way neither of them looked at the other when they spoke. Something had happened in that settlement. Something that had driven them out into the open country with nothing but what they were wearing. Not his problem. "Can't help you," he said. "Move on." He turned back to the fence. "Please." The soft one's voice was barely above a whisper. "Just one night. We'll leave at first light." Said, I can't help you. Can or won't, Eli gritted his teeth. The harder sister had taken a step forward, arms loosely at her sides, chin up. Up close, she was not quite what he'd expected. There was something worn into her face that was older than her years, a kind of tiredness that had been compressed and hardened into something like resolve. Both, he said. Now move along. Before what? She said. Before you call the law. Out here, there is no law. There's just people trying to survive and people trying to take what they've got left. So which are you? He turned slowly to face her. You've got a mouth on you, he said. And you've got a fence falling down, she replied. And about 10 hours to fix it before whoever's pushing you out comes to finish the job. She crossed her arms. I can see desperation from a mile off. You're drowning. So are we. Difference is we're honest about it. The softer sister put a hand on her twin's arm. Clara, don't. Don't what? Don't tell the truth, Clara. That was the name then shook her off, eyes staying on Eli. Look at him, May. He's one bad night from losing everything. Same as us, May. He looked at the softer one. She was looking back at him with something close to pity, but not quite something more careful than that. Something that recognized rather than judged. We don't mean to intrude, May said. We're tired, and we've got nowhere else to go. Eli studied them both for a long moment. Clara all hard edges and defiance. May soft-spoken, but holding her ground. He should send them away. He had enough problems without adding two desperate strangers to the pile. But there was something in May's eyes that stopped him. Not pity, which he'd have hated, but recognition. The look of someone who understood in their bones what it meant to watch everything you'd built turn to dust. Barn's behind the house, he said, finally. There's blankets in the loft. Stay out of my way. May's face softened with relief so genuine it almost hurt to look at. Thank you. Don't thank me. Stay out of sight. Irongate's got eyes everywhere, and the last thing I need is questions about strangers on my land. Clara's eyes sharpened. Irongate, that the one pushing you out? Not your concern? Everything's someone's concern. That's how they win. Eli drove the post hole digger into the ground with more force than necessary. You want shelter? Go. You want to debate land politics? Keep walking. Clara held his gaze for another moment, the kind of moment that had weight to it, that said she was measuring him and hadn't finished, then turned toward the barn. May lingered, looking back at Eli with that unreadable expression. The fence, she said quietly. How much needs fixing? All of it. Can you do it alone? Doesn't matter if I can or can't. It's my fence. May opened her mouth to say something else. Then Clara's voice came from the darkness ahead. May, come on. May looked torn for half a second that Eli felt more than he expected to, then followed her sister toward the barn. Their footsteps faded into the dark. Eli stood alone at the fence line and stared at what remained to be done. 70 yards. 10 hours. One man. He picked up the hammer. An hour later, his hands were bleeding again. The wire had torn through his gloves in a dozen places, leaving raw lines across both palms. He barely noticed. Pain was just another constant now, like thirst and exhaustion, and the sound of wind moving through dead grass. He was working by feel as much as sight, stringing wire by moonlight when light bloomed behind him. He turned sharply. May stood 20 feet back, holding an old kerosene lantern. The light turned her face gold and cast long shadows across the broken fence line ahead. What are you doing? The sharpness in his voice came out before he meant it. Thought you might need light. Got moonlight. Not enough to see wire clearly. She moved closer with deliberate care, the way you'd approach a skittish horse. You'll cut yourself to ribbons working in the dark. Already have. She saw his hands and winced. You should wrap those. Should do a lot of things. May set the lantern down on a flat rock, angling it to throw light across his work area. The difference was immediate. Shadows retreated, details, sharpened. The fence came into focus with the kind of clarity that made the work real instead of just something he was feeling his way through. He wanted to tell her to take it back to the barn. Instead, he turned and kept working. May didn't leave. She stood just outside the circle of light, silent, watching, not judging and not pitying. Just there, a presence in the dark. After a while, the strangeness of it faded. She was quiet in the way that good company is quiet, filling space without demanding anything from it. Your land's beautiful, she said. He almost laughed. You need your eyes checked. No, I mean it. She looked out across the moonlit valley, her voice thoughtful. It's hurting, but underneath you can see what it was, what it could be again. Won't be anything if I can't hold it. The Irongate Company. She said the name like she was reading it off a label. They're taking it. Tomorrow night they're calling the note. He pulled a strand of wire taut and secured it. This fence is the boundary line. It falls, they can claim I'm not maintaining the property. Gives them legal standing to foreclose immediately. That's why you're out here. That's why I'm out here. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how much have you done? 15 yards. Need another 55 by tomorrow night. May looked at the darkness beyond the lantern's reach, then back at him. That's impossible. Probably, Mom. Then why? Because it's mine. The words came out rough, like something that had been lodged in his chest for a long time. This land, this fence, this babe, it's all I've got left. And I'll be damned if I let them take it without making them work for every inch. The silence that followed had weight to it. My sister and I talked, May said softly. We had a home once. Small place. Nothing like this, but it was ours. We lost it when the drought came. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, though the air wasn't cold. Watched everything we'd built just die. We tried to hold on. We tried so hard. Sounds like you gave up. We survived. Her voice stayed gentle, but the word landed with precision. There's a difference. Surviving's not the same as living. No, but you can't live if you don't survive first. He looked at her properly for the first time, really looked the way you can when light is kind and there's no one watching. She was younger than he'd first thought. Mid-20s maybe, but her eyes were older. The kind of old that comes from watching things fall apart. She looked back at him without flinching. The sound of footsteps on hard ground broke the moment. He's not going to thank you for the philosophy, May. Clara stepped out of the shadows beyond the lantern's reach. She'd changed her outer shirt, still dusty but fresher. Her hair was damp at the edges, like she'd found the well and made use of it. She surveyed the scene with those assessing eyes and arrived at conclusions quickly. Just talking, May said. Talking won't fix his fence. Clara looked at Eli directly. You got tools enough for 3 people. Eli frowned. What? Whoa. Hammers, pliers, wire cutters. You got extras. I'm not asking you to. Good, because I'm not asking permission. Clara moved toward the pile of supplies near the fence with the ease of someone walking into their own kitchen. We need shelter. You need labor. Fair trade. May's too polite to push it. I'm not. So where do you need us? Eli stared at her. You don't understand what you're offering. This is brutal work. The wire will cut you. The posts will break your fingers. And even with 3 of us, we probably won't finish in time. Then we won't finish. Clara picked up a pair of wire cutters and tested the grip. But we'll get further than you will alone, unless your pride's worth more than your land. The challenge sat in the air between them like smoke. May watched from behind the lantern, uncertain. Eli wanted to refuse, wanted to send them both back to the barn and finish this alone the way he'd started it. But Clara was right, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it. Lena holds the light, he said finally, using the name before he remembered she'd told him May. He corrected himself without comment. May holds the light. You and me on the post, I set you brace. Don't improvise, don't take chances. If I say stop, you stop, clear. Clara smiled, sharp and satisfied, the smile of someone who'd gotten exactly what they pushed for. Clear. And when morning comes, you both leave. When morning comes, Clara agreed. May lifted the lantern higher, repositioning it to cast more light down the fence line. And the 3 of them turned to face 70 yards of broken boundary stretching into darkness. For the first time in 3 years, Eli Hargrove was not working alone. They worked in silence at first, falling into a rhythm that none of them had planned. Eli dug while Clara stripped away the old rotten wire, and then together they lifted each new post, him driving it down, while she braced it steady with both hands, her weight thrown against it, her jaw set like she was daring the earth to resist. May moved the lantern as needed, anticipating where the light should go before anyone asked for it, retreating when they shifted position, stepping in closer when the work required detail. After the 3rd post, Clara spoke without looking up from the wire she was threading. How long you own this land? Born here, Eli said. Took it over when my father died, 8 years ago. You had family. Had a brother. Lit out for California during the first drought year. Haven't heard from him since. Smart man. Eli's hands tightened on the post. Or a coward. Sometimes they're the same thing. Not to me. Clara yanked a length of rusted wire free. What about your folks? Father worked himself to death trying to keep it. Thought the drought was temporary. Then knew it wasn't and kept fighting anyway. Eli drove the next post. The impact shuddered up through his arms. Third year he had a stroke trying to dig a new well. Died right there in the field. May made a small sound from behind the lantern. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. He died doing what he believed in. Not many people get that. You sound like you admire it, May said carefully. I do, and I hate it. Eli lifted the next post into position. He could have sold out, started over somewhere the drought hadn't hit. But he was too stubborn, chose to die on this land rather than live anywhere else. And now you're doing the same thing, Clara observed, not accusing, just noting it the way you note the weather. Eli didn't answer immediately. That's different. Is it you're fighting a battle you can't win? Refusing help? Planning to go down swinging rather than walk away? She met his eyes across the top of the fence post. Sounds pretty similar to me. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Clara's voice went quiet in a way that was worse than loud. I've watched people give up, Hargrove. I've seen it 100 times. They tell themselves they're fighting, but really they're just waiting, going through the motions until the end comes and they can say they tried. She stepped closer. Is that what this is, a performance of fighting, something to do instead of nothing? The question hit him somewhere below his defenses. Clara, May said softly, leave it. No. Clara looked at him steadily. Someone needs to say it. You want to honor your father, don't die the way he did. Find another way. Adapt. Survive. That's what he'd have wanted, not another grave on that hill. Eli felt anger come up fast and hot. You've got no right. I've got every right. She gestured at the fence, at the dark around them, at the blood on his hands. I'm standing here in the middle of the night, bleeding, helping you fight a battle you claim is yours alone. That buys me the right to be honest. Her eyes never wavered. Your father's dead. This land's dying. And you're so busy trying to be him that you can't see there might be another path. What path? His voice came out rough. Irongate's got the law, got the money, got everything. What path is there besides standing here and making them fight for every inch? Clara was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, the path where you don't stand alone. The words landed like a stone into still water. May moved closer, the lantern swinging gently in her hand, throwing their shadows long across the broken earth. This fence, she said, isn't a last stand, it's a first one. The moment where you decide whether you're going to let them win or make them work for every inch. Eli stared at her. Something in the words reached past the exhaustion and the fear and touched something he had almost forgotten he still had. Not hope, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The memory of what hope felt like. Then sound cut through the night like a blade hoofbeats, distant but approaching. Multiple riders, moving fast. All three of them went still. Irongate, Clara whispered. Maybe. Eli's mind raced. This late, this many riders, either Irongate men checking if he was still here, or something worse. He looked at the sisters. Barn, both of you, now. But if they see you, there will be questions I can't answer. Questions that put you at risk. Go. Clara grabbed May's arm and they ran. Clara pulling May along without hesitation, May casting one worried look back over her shoulder. The lantern went with them, plunging the fence line into cold moonlight. Eli stood alone and listened to the hoofbeats grow louder. 3 riders crested the rise against the star-scattered sky. They weren't Dutch Fen. They were worse. The lead rider was a large man, heavy in the saddle, wearing a coat that had once been expensive. His face was shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, but Eli could see the glint of something at his hip. The 2 men flanking him were lean and careful in the way of hired muscle, the kind who were paid not to think, just to do. They reined up 30 feet from where Eli stood. Eli Hargrove, the big man called out. His voice had the flat authority of someone who was used to sentences that didn't require a response. Who's asking? Name's Whitmore, Cole Whitmore. I work for the Irongate Land Company. He shifted in the saddle, leather creaking. We need to talk. Fen already delivered your message. I've got until tomorrow night. Plans changed. Whitmore dismounted boots, hitting the ground with a heavy final sound. Irongate's accelerating the timeline. They want you off this land by dawn. Eli's blood went cold. That's not what Fenn said. Fenn doesn't make decisions, he delivers them. Whitmore pulled a document from inside his coat and held it out. Different paper, different seal. As of 6 hours ago, your note's been called. You're in default. This land reverts to Irongate effective immediately. 6 hours ago, while Fenn was giving him his 24-hour speech, Irongate had already been moving. This had never been about giving him time. It had been about stringing him along while they finalized the paperwork. I'm not going anywhere, Eli said. Whitmore sighed the way you sigh at a problem you've seen too many times. Some men don't know when they're beaten. I'm not beaten. Yeah, you are. You just haven't seen it yet. He gestured at the fence, at the sagging sections, the rotten posts, the whole failing enterprise. Look around, Hargrove. This land's dead. No water, no crop, no future. You are holding on to a corpse and calling it a farm. Not your call to make. Actually, it is. I represent the legal owners of this property. You're trespassing. Whitmore's voice hardened. Now, you can leave on your feet or we can make you leave. What's it going to be? The two ranch hands moved forward, hands drifting toward their hips with professional ease. Eli stood his ground. His rifle was 20 feet away. Too far. If this turned violent, he'd lose. He knew it, and they knew it, and everyone was waiting to see whether he was smart enough to know it too. He was not. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded to his men. They started forward, and the lantern light bloomed behind Eli like sunrise. Everyone froze. Eli turned. Both sisters stood 20 feet back, having emerged from the darkness without a sound. Clara was on the left holding a pitchfork like a weapon grip, high tines forward her stance, the stance of someone who knew what she was doing. May was on the right, trembling slightly, but standing absolutely straight, the lantern raised high. The light fell across all of them, Eli Whitmore, the ranch hands turning the standoff into something that could be witnessed. He said he's not leaving, Clara called out, her voice carrying across the night air without a waver. So you boys best turn around and ride back to wherever you came from. Whitmore stared at them. Who the hell are you? Doesn't matter who we are. What matters is there's 3 of us and 3 of you, and you're on his land without an invitation. That makes you the trespassers. One of the ranch hands laughed a short, dismissive sound. Girl's holding a pitchfork. And you're holding a gun, Clara said. Guess we'll find out which one's more useful up close. The laughter died. Whitmore's expression shifted, calculating now, running numbers Eli couldn't see. He looked between Clara and May, then at Eli, then back. This is none of your business, he said to the sisters. We're standing on it. May said, her voice shaking slightly, but her words clear. That makes it our business. You've got a smart mouth, Whitmore said to Clara. And you've got about 10 seconds to make a decision, Clara replied. Make them count. The silence that followed was the kind that had real weight to it, the kind where you could feel every person calculating odds and consequences, and the very specific mathematics of whether they wanted this particular kind of trouble tonight. Eli didn't wait for the math to finish. He moved forward. Not back, not sideways forward, toward Whitmore and his men, closing the distance between them in 4 deliberate steps. She's right, he said quietly. You're on my land. I didn't invite you. The law says I can defend my property. The law says this land belongs to Irongate. Then let Irongate prove it in court. Eli stopped 10 feet from Whitmore, close enough to see the anger in his eyes. With a judge, with proper process. Until then, you're trespassing. And I've got witnesses who'll testify to that. Whitmore's jaw worked. He looked at his men. He looked at the sisters. He looked at Eli, at the steadiness in Eli's face, the particular stillness of a man who has decided that he doesn't much care what comes next. This isn't over, he said finally. Didn't think it would be. A long moment, then Whitmore turned and walked back to his horse. His men followed the right-hand one, keeping his eyes on Clara the whole way, which Clara met without blinking. They mounted and rode into the darkness, hoofbeats fading until there was only the wind and the distant sound of Eli's own pulse. Silence. He stood there, adrenaline still singing through his veins like a wire pulled too tight. You're shaking, May's voice soft and close. He looked down at his hands. She was right. Adrenaline, he said. Stupidity, Clara corrected. But there was no heat behind it. You walked right at them. That was either brave or suicidal. Probably both. Could have gotten you killed. Could have. Didn't. He looked at them both, at Clara with her pitchfork still in hand, at May with the lantern she'd held steady through all of it. What were you thinking coming out like that? Same thing you were, Clara said. That running only works until it doesn't. They had guns. So we had surprise and numbers. Clara shouldered the pitchfork with a practicality that was almost funny under the circumstances. Besides, you helped us. Fair's fair. Eli shook his head, still processing. Two women he'd met 3 hours ago had just stood between him and armed men, not because they owed him anything, not because it was smart, but because it was right. Why, he asked. Why do that for a stranger? May looked at him with those quiet eyes. Because you're not a stranger anymore, she said. You're someone fighting to keep what's his. And if we don't stand up for people like that, who will? Something loosened in Eli's chest. Some knot of isolation he'd carried so long he'd stopped feeling its edges. He looked at the fence, then at the two women in the lamplight, both exhausted, both ready to keep going. We finished the fence, he said. All of it. Before dawn. If they're coming back, I want this boundary marked clear and legal. Clara looked at the darkness ahead, calculating, then back at him. Then we better get started. May lifted the lantern. The three of them turned back to the work. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, the dry kind that promised rain it never intended to deliver. But Eli barely heard it. He was already moving, already reaching for the next post, already part of something that for the first time and longer than he could remember felt like more than just survival. It felt like a beginning. Part 2, they worked through the darkest hours like people who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to hold back. Post after post, wire after wire, the fence climbed out of ruin and into something that resembled structure, if not quite beauty. Each section they completed felt like a small act of defiance against the weight of impossible odds, a declaration made in split timber and rusted wire. We are still here. Eli's hands had stopped bleeding, mostly because they'd gone numb. Sensation replaced by a dull insistence of pressure that he'd stopped interpreting as pain. He could feel blisters forming beneath the raw skin, layers of damage compounding, but he didn't slow down. Slowing down was a kind of dying, and he wasn't ready for that. Not tonight. Clara worked beside him with mechanical precision, her movements economical and deliberate in the way of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on anything that didn't count. She didn't flinch when splinters drove into her palms. She didn't complain when the barbed wire opened a shallow cut across her forearm. She just looked at it, pressed it against her coat sleeve without breaking rhythm, and kept going. The wound would be there tomorrow. The fence needed to be there tomorrow more. May moved between them like a third kind of intelligence, quieter and more attentive than either. She held the light where it was needed, past tools before anyone thought to ask for them. Watched the horizon every few minutes with the nervous vigilance of someone keeping a private count of things that might go wrong. They're not coming back tonight, Clara said without looking up from the wire she was threading through a new staple. Not worth the risk in the dark. How do you know? May asked. Because men like Whitmore prefer advantage numbers, daylight witnesses to make it look legal. Coming back in the dark would be admitting what they really are. Clara gave the wire a sharp pull to test the tension. Thieves with paperwork. Eli almost smiled. Almost. That about covers it, he said. They fell back into silence, and Eli found it had a different quality than the silence he'd been living in for 3 years. His silence had been the silence of a man talking to empty rooms, the silence of effort with no one to observe it, the silence of grief with no one to share it. This was different. This was occupied silence, 3 people thinking their separate thoughts with some awareness of the other's presence that made the dark feel less absolute. Tell me about this land, May said after a while. Not the drought-killed land in front of them, but the question behind the question. Before, what was it like? Eli paused, caught somewhere unexpected. No one had asked him that in years. People came, they saw the dust and the dead grim and the collapsing fence, and they made their calculations. The before had stopped being real to anyone but him. Green, he said finally. So green it would hurt your eyes in summer, grass up to your knees in the low fields. There was a creek that ran year-round, cold enough to make your teeth ache even in July. He drove another post, the impact reverberating through his shoulders. My father used to say the valley was proof that hard work mattered, that if you took care of the land would take care of you. What happened to him? May's voice was careful. You said he died. The drought happened. First year he thought it was temporary, spent everything trying to keep the stock alive, keep the fields watered. Second year he knew it wasn't temporary, but he couldn't stop fighting. Couldn't accept that the land he'd given everything to was dying on him. Eli's hands worked the wire without conscious direction. Third year he had a stroke trying to dig a new well. Died right there in the field. I'm sorry, May said softly. Don't be. He died doing what he believed in. He paused, surprised by what came next. Not many people get that. You sound like you admire it, she said carefully. I do, and I hate it. He lifted the next post. He could have sold, could have moved somewhere the drought hadn't hit and started over, but he was too proud, too certain that this land owed him something for all he'd put into it. Eli set the post. He chose to die here rather than live anywhere else. And now you're doing the same thing, Clara observed from where she crouched with the wire cutters. Eli looked at her sharply. You're fighting a battle you can't win, she continued not unkindly. Refusing help until it shows up without asking. Planning to go down swinging because the alternative feels like cowardice. She cut the wire clean and final. Sound familiar? That's different. Is it, what's the difference? The difference is, I know what I'm doing. Your father knew too, Clara said. That's the problem with stubborn men who love their land. They always know exactly what they're doing, right up until it kills them. She stood brushing dust from her knees. Someone needs to tell you knowing isn't the same as being right. Eli wanted to argue. He could feel the words building. But Clara had already moved to the next post and picked up the brace, planting her feet to hold it while he lined up the next swing. The moment passed, the work continued. After a while, May spoke again. My sister saved my life once, in the settlement. Clara's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. May, she said quietly. He's helping us. He's asked no questions we didn't offer to answer. May kept her eyes on Eli. There was a man in the settlement, a foreman from one of the northern ranches. He decided he wanted something he wasn't offered. She paused. He decided, Clara specifically. Interest he wouldn't let go of, Clara said flatly, even when told no, even when told again, louder. So she made him let go, May said, with a shovel handle. Eli processed that. He did, Clara said. His pride didn't, and his family had pull and money, so our word was worth exactly nothing against his. We left before they could make an example of us. She glanced at Eli. 3 days walking in summer heat to get away from men who think no is a starting position. Eli nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of the territory to know how that calculus worked, men with money and connections, women with nothing but the truth. The drought had made it worse everywhere. Desperation had a way of peeling back whatever thin layer of decency people had managed to accumulate, and what was underneath wasn't always pretty. He follow you, Eli asked. Doubt it. 3 days in summer heat, he'll find easier prey. Clara's voice carried no bitterness about this, just fact. We're not your problem. We'll work tonight, leave tomorrow, and you'll never see us again. Unless Irongate takes your land. Then we'll all be in the same situation, May added quietly. Eli drove the next post without answering. They worked in silence for a stretch, the rhythm of the work becoming something almost meditative. The muscle memory of repetitive labor carrying the body forward while the mind roamed free. The fence climbed steadily. Eli kept checking the sky without meaning to, reading the stars' positions the way his father had taught him, doing the math on hours remaining. By the time May spoke again, they were past the midway mark. You talked earlier, she said, like this might be a last stand, like you already knew how it ended? She moved the lantern closer. You really think it is? Eli was quiet for a moment, honest enough with himself to admit what came up when he sat with the question. Maybe, he said. Maybe this fence is just something to do instead of nothing. Something to push back against so it doesn't feel like just waiting. That's not true, May said immediately. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know that look. She moved closer, the lantern swinging gently. I've worn it. When we lost our home, when we watched everything crumble, and I had nowhere to put the grief of it. She met his eyes. I wanted to stay, to just stop moving and let whatever came next come. Clara wouldn't let me. She dragged me out when I wanted to stay, kept me walking when I wanted to lie down. May's voice softened. She saved my life by refusing to let me decide it was over. That's what you're doing out here. You just don't know it yet. Eli stared at her. This fence isn't a last stand, she said. It's a first one. The moment where you stop letting them decide the terms. He didn't get a chance to answer because the sound came out of the darkness and, without warning, hoofbeats again, but this time from the north and fast. More riders than before. Eli counted the rhythm automatically 4, maybe 5 horses. All 3 of them froze. Barn, Eli said. Now, both of you. We're not, Clara started. Clara, he looked at her directly. I need to know you're safe to be able to do what comes next. Can you give me that? A pause short-waited. Then Clara nodded, grabbed May's arm, and they moved. The lantern went with them. Eli was plunged into silver moonlight, standing alone at the fence, as 4 riders came over the ridge and resolved into shapes against the sky. Not Whitmore. Someone new. Someone. The lead rider was a different kind of man, smaller, older, dressed in dark town clothes rather than ranch gear. The 2 flanking him wore badges. The 4th, trailing slightly, was a nervous-looking young man with ink-stained fingers who could only be a clerk, a judge, circuit court by the look of his coat, and a sheriff. They reined up, and the judge dismounted with the careful precision of a man accustomed to being watched. Eli Hargrove, he said. His voice was dry and measured, each word placed with deliberate economy. I'm Judge Ira Selleck. We need to talk. About what? About this land, about your debts, about whether we can resolve this without further difficulty. He walked forward, stopping at the fence line, and studied the new construction with what might have been something like respect. You've been busy, within my rights. Indeed. Selleck's gaze moved to the dark house behind Eli. I noticed you had help. Traveled alone. 3 sets of footprints in the dust suggest otherwise. His voice remained mild conversational, not accusatory. I'm not here to make trouble about that, but I need to know who's on this land for the record. Travelers, Eli said carefully, passing through, needed shelter for a night. And they helped you build fence out of gratitude. Something like that. Selleck studied him for a moment with eyes that had seen a great many poor liars in their time. Then he reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. These are legal papers transferring ownership of this property to the Irongate Land Company, effective immediately. I'm here to serve them and oversee the transition. You're in default on your note, Hargrove. The law is clear. Eli looked at the papers. He didn't take them. What happens if I don't sign? The sheriff enforces the foreclosure. You're removed from the property if necessary. The land transfers regardless. Selleck's voice carried something Eli hadn't expected, not satisfaction, but a kind of controlled regret. You can pay your debts, or you can't. The law doesn't ask which you'd prefer. That's not law, that's organized theft with better clothing. Selleck's mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. Perhaps, but it's legal theft, which means it stands. He folded the papers and tucked them back into his coat. You have until noon. I'll be back at 12 o'clock, and after that the sheriff executes the order. I'm sorry, Hargrove. That's all I can give you. He turned and walked back to his horse. The 4 men rode a short distance and stopped making their vigil visible close enough to watch far enough to give the illusion of space. Eli stood at the fence for a long time after not moving, holding the hammer he'd forgotten he was still carrying. The house door opened. Clara and May came across the yard in the dark, moving quickly, their faces reading the situation without being told. We heard enough, Clara said when she reached him. Eli looked at her. Noon. They're giving me until noon. What are you going to do? He turned and looked at the fence, the sections they'd built through the night, solid and standing 40 yards of it now, with 30 more to go. He looked at his father's house behind them, dark and waiting. He looked at the ridge where Whitmore had come from, and the road where Selleck and his men now waited. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I've got until noon to figure it out. They went inside. The kitchen was cold and quiet in the way of spaces that had been lived in and then gradually abandoned, things sitting exactly where they'd last been placed by hands that no longer reached for them. Eli's father's chair sat by the dead fireplace. His mother's quilt hung on the wall, faded from its original colors to something softer and sadder. Everything was exactly as it had been 3 years ago, the whole house frozen like a photograph of before. May moved to the stove and began building a fire before anyone asked her to. Clara went to the window and stood watch on the road. Eli sank into his father's chair and felt the familiar shape of it, the leather worn to the contours of a different man's body. Eat something, May said without looking up. Not hungry. That wasn't a question. She found coffee in a tin on the shelf and measured it by feel. None of us can think straight on empty stomachs. Whatever happens next requires thinking. Clara turned from the window. How much time? Eli checked the old pocket watch. 4 hours, maybe less. Then we talk it through. She pulled a chair from the table and sat backwards on it, arms crossed over the back. Option 1, you sign the papers. What happens? Eli's jaw tightened. I lose the land. Take their $100. Walk away. You lose the land, Clara repeated. Not everything. You'd still have your life, your health, your freedom to start over somewhere their shadow doesn't reach. That's not, I know it's not enough. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it's not nothing. Her eyes were steady and unsentimental. Option 2, you refuse to sign. What happens? Selleck executes the foreclosure. Sheriff drags me off. And we stand with you, May said from the stove. Same as last night. No, Eli's voice was sharp. You don't. If it comes to violence, you run. Both of you. That's not negotiable. Partners, May said quietly. Remember, you don't get to make that call unilaterally. I make it anyway. I won't have your deaths on my conscience, not for land that's already... He stopped. Clara watched him with those calm, measuring eyes. Already lost. The words sat there. That's what you were going to say, she continued. Already lost. You know it. You've known it. Eli closed his eyes. Then accept it, May said. He opened his eyes. She was standing at the table now, holding 2 cups of coffee, looking at him with that same fierce gentleness she'd shown at the fence. Accept it, she said again. Accept that the land's lost. Accept that fighting Selleck and the law head-on is suicide. Accept all of it. She set the cups down. And then decide whether you're going to let that be the end of your story. What else is there? The question came out quieter than he'd intended. He gave you until noon, May said. Why, Bisama, Eli frowned. To make it easier. Give me time to... Or, she said, because even he knows it's wrong. He called it legal theft, Eli. Not justice, not proper procedure. Theft. That's not a judge proud of his work. That's a man following orders he doesn't believe in. Clara leaned forward. You think he's conflicted? I think he's human, and humans can be swayed. May moved to the window beside Clara, looking out at where Selleck and his men waited in the dark. They're doing this quietly because nobody's watching. Nobody cares. But what if people did watch? What if this became a story instead of a transaction? The idea took shape slowly, like something assembling itself in real time. Witnesses, Clara said, more than witnesses. May turned back to face them. A crowd, people from town, neighboring farms, anyone who might care that Irongate is taking the land from a man who can't defend himself alone. She looked at Eli. You said your father believed in this valley, that hard work mattered, that the land rewarded those who cared for it. How many other people in this valley believe the same thing? Most of them, Eli said slowly, before the drought. And now they're watching each other fall, May said, one farm at a time, while Irongate picks up the pieces and nobody says anything because nobody wants to be next. She crossed her arms. But if you make a stand, not a violent one, just a visible one, if you make this impossible to do in the dark, maybe some of them remember what they believed in. Maybe enough of them show up that Selleck can't ignore it. Eli wanted to believe it. He could feel the wanting in his chest like a held breath. People are scared, desperate. They won't risk Irongate's retaliation for a stranger. You're not a stranger. You're one of them. May's eyes were steady and certain. And more than that, you're a test case. If they can take your land this easily, everyone else knows they're next. That's not abstract. That's immediate, personal. She's right, Clara said, surprising him. Whitmore was already aggressive last night, pushing timelines using intimidation. Other landowners are watching, wondering when their turn comes. She met Eli's eyes. So we give them a reason to care. We ride into town. We tell everyone what's happening. We invite them to come witness. She let that sit. Not to fight, just to stand, to be seen, to make Selleck do this in front of an audience. And if it doesn't work, Eli asked. Then it doesn't work, Clara said simply. But we'll have tried everything before the hammer falls. That's not nothing. Eli looked at them both, Clara calculating and certain May, burning with quiet conviction, and made his decision with the abruptness of a man who has stopped negotiating with his own doubt. We leave now, he said, before Irongate realizes what we're planning. They moved fast. Eli retrieved the deed and title from the lockbox under his parents' bed. Original documents, everything proving 3 generations of legal ownership. May packed food, dried meat, hard bread, a canteen. Clara checked the rifle which Eli insisted she leave behind. Showing up in town armed would send the wrong message entirely. They walked out into the pre-dawn dark together. Selleck looked up from where he'd been waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting. Going somewhere, town, Eli said. Getting legal counsel before I sign anything. That's within your rights. Selleck's voice was even. You have until noon. We'll be back in 2.5 hours. Something shifted in Selleck's expression, some small rearrangement that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't quite its opposite either. Just make sure you are, he said. After noon, I can't protect you from what Whitmore decides to do on my own. It wasn't quite a warning, it wasn't quite not one. They turned toward the road without answering. Behind them, Selleck's men watched until they disappeared around the bend. He's scared, Clara said when they were out of earshot. What makes you say that? May asked. The warning. He didn't have to tell us to be back by noon. He didn't have to mention Whitmore or protection. He's worried about what happens if this gets messier. She walked steadily, eyes on the road ahead. Men like Selleck, they follow orders, but they have a point where the orders start costing more than they're willing to pay. He's near that point. That's something we can use, Eli said. That's everything, Clara agreed. They reached town after 45 minutes of hard walking, arriving as the first real light was turning the sky from black to gray. The streets were starting to show life, a few early risers smoke from the bakery, the blacksmith's door already open. Small signs of a community going through the motions of existing. They split up. Eli took the saloon where the early drinkers tended to be men with nothing left to lose. Clara took the church and the boarding house women first, on the theory that women in this valley had the most to gain from someone drawing a line. May took the general store and the doctor's office, moving through conversations with the quiet persistence of someone who had learned that persuasion worked differently than force. Eli pushed into the saloon and told his story to 4 men who looked at him with the careful blankness of people who've heard too many bad endings. He didn't dress it up. He didn't promise them safety or victory. He told them what was happening, what it meant for their own land, and what he was asking, come witness. Just stand. Just be seen. Even if you're right, what's witnessing going to do? One of them asked. An older rancher, hands like leather eyes, like someone who'd been disappointed by hope too many times. They got the law. They got the money. We've got numbers, Eli said. So, and attention, make this public enough, make enough noise, maybe someone with real power notices. Maybe a territorial governor asks questions. Maybe a newspaper runs a story that embarrasses the right people. That's not much to bet on. It's more than nothing, which is what we've got if we all sit here and wait for our own turn. The old rancher set down his glass and studied Eli for a long moment. What time? Noon. My place on the Eastern Road. I'll think about it. He moved to the feed store, the blacksmith, the doctor's office, each time the same story, the same appeal to self-interest and community alike. Some turned away, some listened and said nothing either way. Some promised to consider it, which was probably no, but not definitely no. By the time they regrouped outside the general store, Eli had 6 solid commitments and a dozen maybes. Clara reported 3 definites and 5 refusals. May had found 2 with one woman, Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house and had lived in the valley longer than almost anyone who was deeply sympathetic, but wouldn't risk Irongate's retaliation against her property. They worked the street together, after that stopping everyone who would stop. Eli told his story until the words wore grooves in his throat. May appealed to conscience and shared history, the understanding that communities survived by standing together or perished by falling separately. Clara took the harder-edged, pragmatic, unsparing, pointing out that every farm Irongate took made them stronger and everyone else weaker. Slowly, reluctantly, people began to commit. Not because they believed they could win, not because they trusted that justice would prevail, but because enough of them recognized somewhere beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the 3 years of drought ground down survival that this moment meant something. That being present for it meant something. That if they couldn't do anything else, they could at least be witnesses. 27 people. That was the count when they had to turn back. 27 farmers, shopkeepers, and drifters who had chosen for reasons that ranged from principle to pragmatism to the simple human stubborn refusal to look away, who had chosen to walk the eastern road to a failing ranch and stand against something that was happening to all of them. As they led the column back over the rise toward Eli's land, he saw what waited below and felt his stomach drop. Selleck and his men were still there, but they'd been joined by others. Cole Whitmore sat heavy on his horse at the center of a loose ring of 6 ranch hands, the kind of men you hired when you wanted a problem handled rather than solved. They were spread in a semicircle, positioned with the unconscious geometry of men accustomed to surrounding things. Irongate had brought reinforcements. Clara looked at Eli. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were calm, with the particular calm of someone who has already decided. "You want to turn back?" "No, good." He turned to address the people behind him, his people he thought, feeling the weight of that word and what it meant. "When we get down there," he said quietly, "I need you to form a line along the fence. Don't threaten, don't engage. Just stand, just be seen. Make them do this in front of all of you. A man in the back, and if they try to move us, don't move willingly, don't resist with force, make them work for every inch." It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was all they had. He turned back to the road and started down the slope, and 27 people followed. Selleck saw them coming. His expression moved through several things quickly before settling on something hard and watchful. Whitmore's face darkened with open anger, the specific fury of a man who'd sent a message and gotten back the wrong answer. By the time they reached the fence line, 27 people standing shoulder to shoulder along the eastern boundary formed a wall that was not impressive in any military sense and was utterly impossible to dismiss. Whitmore pushed his horse forward. "What the hell is this?" "Witnesses," Eli said. Citizens of this valley exercising their right to observe legal proceedings. This isn't a public matter. Foreclosure sets precedent for every landowner in the territory. Seems pretty public to me. These people can watch all they want. Won't stop what's coming." "Then you won't mind them being here," Clara said from beside Eli, her voice carrying clearly. "Will you?" It was not a question. Whitmore's eyes found the particular way she was standing, the way she held his gaze without dropping it, the memory of last night, were written in his expression alongside something harder. "You again," he said. "Me again. You assaulted a Irongate representative last night. I defended a property owner from trespassing armed men with a farming implement." She held his stare. Funny how perspective works. Whitmore's hand moved towards his hip. Several of the ranch hands shifted. The crowd behind Eli stirred nervous energy rippling through 27 people who were suddenly understanding in a visceral and immediate way exactly how close to the edge they were standing. Selleck stepped his horse between them. "Everyone stand down," he said. His voice had iron in it, now no longer the measured tones of the patient administrator, but the voice of a man exercising actual authority. "Now," Whitmore glared at him. "You want to charge 27 witnesses and create an incident that brings territorial scrutiny down on Irongate," Selleck said quietly, leaning slightly forward. "Be my guest, but I will not be part of it." A long moment. Then Whitmore sat back in his saddle. Selleck turned to Eli. "You've got your audience." He held out the foreclosure papers. "Does that change your answer?" Eli looked at the papers. He looked at the 27 people standing at the fence they'd built through the night. He looked at Clara on his left and May on his right, both steady, both certain. He took the papers from Selleck's hands. And in front of 27 witnesses with the morning sun climbing toward its apex, Eli Hargrove tore the foreclosure documents clean in half. The sound of tearing paper cut through the valley like something physical. No one moved. No one breathed. The pieces fluttered in Eli's hands, edges catching the dry wind, and the silence stretched out long and absolute. Then Whitmore exploded forward. "You son of a—" Clara stepped in front of Eli in the same instant that the crowd surged forward, 27 people, none of them armed, moving together as a single thing. They formed a wall of bodies between Eli and Whitmore's fury, ordinary people standing in the way of a force that had been used to going wherever it wanted. Whitmore's ranch hands drew their guns. The crowd didn't back down. "Holster those weapons," Selleck snapped. "Now!" The hands hesitated, looked to Whitmore, back to Selleck. "Now," Selleck said again with the finality of a man who has used up his patience entirely. Reluctantly, the guns went back to their holsters. Selleck turned to Eli, fury and something very like fear competing in his expression. "You've committed contempt," he said tightly. "Destruction of legal documents. I can have you arrested." "Then do it," Eli said quietly, "in front of all these witnesses. Arrest a man for refusing to surrender his legal property without proper representation. Let's see how that reads in the territorial papers." Selleck's jaw worked. He understood the trap that had been built around him. Any action he took now would be public documented, witnessed. Impossible to spin as routine procedure. The 27 people standing at the fence had changed the entire calculation. "This isn't over," Selleck said finally. "I'll get new documents. I'll come back with the territorial marshal if I have to. Next time there won't be a choice." "Next time," Eli said, "I'll have a lawyer. And these folks will still be watching." Selleck looked at the crowd for a long moment, some calculation happening behind his eyes that Eli couldn't read. Then he turned to Whitmore. "We're leaving. This isn't the time or the place." Whitmore's face had gone the color of coals. "The hell it isn't." "I said we're leaving." Selleck's voice left no room. "You want to handle this your way, file papers. That's the legal path. What you're thinking right now is not the legal path, and I will testify to that." Another long suspended moment. Then Whitmore wheeled his horse and drove it hard down the road, his men following in a cloud of dust, Selleck's clerk and the sheriff trailing behind. Selleck lingered alone. He looked at Eli. "Brave," he said quietly, "or stupid. I honestly can't tell the difference." "Does it matter?" Selleck was quiet for a moment. "Your father said something similar once, right before the drought killed him." He picked up his reins. "I hope you're smarter than he was." He paused. "I doubt it." He rode away. The crowd held its formation until all the Irongate men were gone. Then, like a collective exhale, the tension broke. People turned to each other, voices overlapping, laughter mixed with disbelief, the sound of 27 people processing what they'd just done. Eli felt his knees wobble. Clara's hand found his elbow, steadying. "Not yet," she said quietly. "They're still watching." She was right. He straightened, looked out at the faces turned toward him. Admiration, fear, relief, uncertainty. People who had taken a risk and needed to know it had meant something. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the fence line. "What you did here, standing witness, refusing to let them do this in the dark, that changes things." "For how long?" someone called. "Long enough," Eli said. "And next time we'll be ready. We'll have legal standing, documentation. We'll make them prove their case instead of just asserting it." He met the man's eyes. "If they come for your land next, we stand with you, the way you stood with me today." An older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Kowalski from 2 towns over, who had lived in the valley longer than most. "You're talking about fighting Irongate long-term. That's not a battle, son. That's a war." "Maybe it is," Eli said. "But it's a war we're already in. We've just been fighting it one farm at a time, alone in the dark. Maybe it's time we fought it together." The crowd absorbed that. Slowly, people began to nod. As they dispersed, some stopped to grip Eli's hand, to offer quiet words, to look at him with expressions that said more than any words could carry. Others slipped away quickly, already second-guessing, already calculating the cost of what they'd done today. By the time the sun reached its midpoint, only 3 people remained at the fence. "That was insane," May said. Her voice shook with delayed reaction. "Tearing up those papers. Defying Selleck in front of everyone. That was absolutely insane." "Probably," Eli admitted. "It worked," Clara said. "They left. You're still here. The land's still yours." She looked at him steadily. "For now." "For now is all any of us have," Eli said. And somewhere in the valley below them, thunder rolled again. Closer this time. Part 3. They rested for 2 hours by Clara's insistence and May's enforcement. Eli argued. Clara pointed out that arguing wasted energy they didn't have. May made coffee strong enough to strip paint from a barn door and set a plate of food in front of him without ceremony, and somewhere between the first cup and the second exhaustion, overruled pride, and Eli slept in his father's chair. He dreamed of the fence stretching to the horizon wire, gleaming like silver thread against a green valley that no longer existed. His father was there working beside him, saying something Eli couldn't quite hear. When he turned to ask him to repeat it, his father's face dissolved and became Clara's, then May's, then nothing at all. When he woke, the sun had moved a meaningful distance across the sky. 3 hours, Clara said from the window, not looking at him. You said 2. You needed 3. We made an executive decision. May was at the table writing in careful script, a list spreading across the page in her even hand. She looked up when he stirred. Documenting everyone who stood with us today. Names, where they're from, what they said. You were right that we need it. Eli stood slowly, his body protesting with a specificity that told him exactly which muscles he'd abused and how badly. Anything on the road? Quiet, Claire said. Too quiet. Whitmore's back in town planning, not watching. That means we've got time, not much, but some. Eli moved to the window beside her and looked out at the scorched eastern boundary. The day was full and hot midday light, making the valley look even more exhausted than it was. His fence, what remained of the sections they hadn't finished, stood along the line like a soldier who'd lost most of his unit. They needed to complete it. We should work, he said. Finish the back sections while we have the chance. Every post we don't drive is ammunition for Whitmore's next move. And we should prepare, Clara added, for what's coming after the fence. Legal first, May said, not looking up from her writing. You need to file a formal response to the foreclosure. Document the procedural violations in Irongate's timeline. The note being sold without proper notice, the deadlines that changed every time you tried to comply. She set down her pen. If there's a lawyer willing to touch this— There isn't, Eli said. Selleck as good as told me. Irongate owns the banks, the businesses, half the politics in the county. No local lawyer will risk the relationship. Local, Clara said. Eli looked at her. You said no local lawyer will risk it. What about territorial counsel? Someone who doesn't depend on Irongate's goodwill for their practice. She turned from the window. The territorial capital is 3 days' ride. The governor's up for re-election. He needs votes from territories like this one, and nothing costs votes faster than being tied to a land grab that looks like theft. She held his gaze. We could go directly. The room went quiet. May set her pen down completely and looked up. Go to the Capitol, Eli said, slowly turning the idea over. File a complaint with the governor's office. Bring May's documentation, your deed, the witnesses' names. Make the case that this is systematic, not just one farmer's bad debt, but a pattern of organized abuse targeting everyone in the valley. Clara moved to the table and spread her hands across May's list. 47 documented cases, you said. 47 foreclosures in 3 years by the same company using the same tactics. That's not business. That's a campaign. That's also a target, May said quietly. If we go public, if we take this to the governor, to newspapers, Irongate won't just push harder against you. They'll go after everyone who stood with us today. Make an example. Show people what happens when they don't scatter. The silence that followed had weight. She's right, Eli said. He'd been thinking the same thing. Whitmore will retaliate. Maybe not against me directly, not with witnesses everywhere, and Selleck's implicit warning still hanging in the air, but against the people who stood at that fence. Clara looked at her sister. May looked back. The twin communication passed between them like weather. Then we have to move before he does, Clara said finally. If we're going to the Capitol, we go tonight, before Whitmore realizes what we're planning, before he can put pressure on the witnesses to recant or disappear. We can't leave the property unattended, Eli said. Irongate's whole legal argument depends on abandonment. If the land shows no owner, no maintenance, they have immediate grounds for seizure. One of us stays, May said. The words landed quietly, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. Clara looked at her sister. No, it should be me. May's voice was calm and decided. I'm less threatening than either of you, less likely to provoke Whitmore's men into something stupid if they come sniffing around. I can hide if serious violence comes. I'm better at waiting than fighting. She met Eli's eyes. You two are better at the fighting part, and the Capitol needs people who can fight. Lena, Eli said, using her name wrong again, catching himself. May, if Whitmore's men show up, I run north into the hills until you're back. I know where. I'll be fine. She picked up her pen again. We agreed to be a unit. That means trusting each other to do the part we're best suited for. This is mine. Clara crossed the room and stood in front of her sister. They looked at each other for a moment that Eli didn't have the right words for the particular language of people who have survived things together that can't be fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. You run if anything serious comes, Clara said. You don't try to hold it alone. I run if it gets serious. Promise me. I promise. May's eyes were stubby. Now go, both of you, before we talk ourselves out of it. They prepared quickly. Eli gathered the deed, the title documents, everything that proved 3 generations of Hargrove ownership and 20 violations of proper legal procedure in the Irongate foreclosure. Clara packed light and practical food for the road. The rifle Eli insisted on this time, extra ammunition. May packed enough food to last the week, found the old shotgun in the back of the closet, checked its load with the ease of someone who'd handled firearms before. At the door, Eli turned back. If it gets bad, I know. She held his gaze. Come back, both of you. He nodded once and didn't trust himself to say anything else. They went out into the afternoon heat, 2 people on horseback, heading east, while someone important stood in a doorway and watched them go. For a long time after they crested the first ridge, Eli didn't speak. Clara rode beside him and matched his silence, which he appreciated more than he could have said. The valley spread below them, brown and exhausted under merciless summer sky, other farms visible in the middle distance, most of them dark and still. Tell me about your parents, Clara said after an hour. He glanced at her. Why? Because you're riding toward a fight for something they built, and you've been carrying them like a weight. I want to understand the weight. Eli was quiet for a moment. My mother died before the drought. She was the one who really loved the land, not the idea of it, but the actual work, getting her hands into soil. She could tell you what a field needed just by walking through it. He looked at the horizon. My father loved the idea of it, the legacy, the family name attached to good land. When she died, I think the land became, I don't know, a monument to her. He stopped knowing how to just live on it and started needing to preserve it like a museum. And that killed him. That and the drought, but yes. Eli adjusted his hat against the sun. He was so busy trying to hold on to what it had been that he couldn't figure out how to survive what it was becoming. He mistook stubbornness for faithfulness. And you, Clara's voice was careful. Have you made the same mistake? He didn't answer right away. The horses moved beneath them, steady and patient, eating up the miles. I've been afraid to ask myself that question, he said finally. If the answer was yes, I did not know what I'd do with it. What's the answer? Maybe. He felt the word cost something. Maybe I've been living in a monument to what this land was, fighting to preserve the shape of something that's already changed beyond recognition. He exhaled slowly. But maybe that's different from your father's mistake. He couldn't see any future for the land. I can. I just needed someone to remind me it existed. Clara looked at him sideways. The afternoon light made her face look younger, less armored than usual. May does that better than I do. She does, Eli agreed. You do something different. You make it impossible to pretend. Is that a compliment? It is. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, our mother used to say May was the heart of us and I was the spine. I thought it was a criticism for a long time. Like being the spine meant being hard, being the part that holds up but doesn't feel. She paused. She didn't mean it that way. She meant that some people feel things by going toward them, and some people feel things by holding them up while others do, that both were necessary, that you couldn't have one without the other. She sounds like she was wise. She was practical, which is sometimes the same thing. Clara looked ahead at the road. We lost her 2 years before we lost the homestead. I think that's why May took it so hard when the land went. She'd already lost the person who made home feel like home. After that, there was just a place that used to be one. Eli thought of his father's chair, of his mother's quilt on the wall faded from its colors. Yeah, he said, I know that. They rode until dark and camped without fire, taking turns on watch. Clara took first shift. Eli lay back and looked at stars that felt impossibly far away, too bright and too indifferent to care what was happening down here in the dust. He woke in the gray pre-dawn to Clara's hand on his shoulder. "Riders," she said quietly, coming fast from the west. He was up instantly, rifle in hand. They pressed close to their horses and waited as hoofbeats thundered past in the dark, 4 riders moving hard back toward the valley, back toward where May was alone. "We have to go back," Eli said immediately. "We can't." Clara's voice was flat with the flatness of someone who is feeling the opposite of flat and containing it by sheer force. "We turn back, we lose everything. The plan falls apart. May knows how to hide, she promised. She'll be fine. 4 riders. She's smart and she's armed, and she promised to run. If we go back, we betray everything she's risking so we can finish this." Clara gripped his arm. "Keep riding, Eli, that's what she'd want." He stood in the dark and felt himself torn in 2 directions with the specific agony of people who care about more than one thing at once. Then he mounted his horse. They pushed hard through the rest of the night, putting miles between themselves and everything they were leaving behind. By the time the territorial capital appeared on the third evening, a collection of buildings larger than anything in the valley streets crowded, and loud with the noise of a place that didn't know the drought was happening, Eli had spent 2 days trying not to think about May alone on that property and mostly failing. They found a boarding house near the government quarter. Cheap rooms, shared water, a landlady who asked no questions. Cleaned up as best they could, 3 days of hard riding showed on both of them in ways that soap couldn't fully fix. Clara looked at him across the narrow hallway between their rooms. "You look terrible," she said. "You look like you've been through a war." "We have." She pushed her door open. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we make the case." At 7:30 in the morning, they were standing outside the governor's office. At 8 o'clock, a clerk let them in with professional disinterest and no appointment. At 8:15, a deputy administrator named Carver intercepted them with smooth efficiency and heard 3 sentences before his expression shifted. At 8:30, they were shown into the office of Governor Aldous Crane. He was younger than Eli expected, maybe 40, with the careful grooming and measured bearing of a man who had learned very early that image was a form of argument. He was reading through documents his assistant must have given him, a hasty summary of their situation. Eli guessed condensed into something digestible for a busy man. When he looked up, his eyes were the eyes of a politician, calculating, attentive, always measuring what was being offered against what was being asked. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "and Miss Voss, is it?" "Just Clara. My deputy tells me you're making serious allegations against the Irongate Land Company." "I'm reporting crimes," Eli said, "with documentation." Crane leaned back. "The Irongate Land Company has been a significant contributor to territorial development, infrastructure, employment, settlement. They've also systematically foreclosed on 47 properties in 3 years, using irregular process intimidation and debt purchased through legal manipulation designed to deny landowners time to respond." Eli set the folder on the desk. May's careful documentation, his deed, the witness names, everything. "That's not development. That's organized theft." Crane looked at the folder without touching it. "One man's fraud claim. 47 families," Clara interrupted. "One company, 3 years, the same tactics in every case. Debts sold without proper notice. Timelines that changed whenever the landowner tried to comply. Intimidation by armed men before any legal process completed." She leaned forward slightly. "That's not a pattern that happens by accident. That's a strategy." Crane studied them both, 2 people who had ridden 3 days, and looked at who were sitting in his office with the particular intensity of people who had run out of other options. "What exactly are you asking?" he said. "Suspension of all Irongate foreclosures pending investigation," Eli said. "An independent counsel with subpoena authority, someone who doesn't owe Irongate anything, and a ruling affirming my legal ownership until the investigation concludes." "That's significant ask." "It's a minimal response to systematic corruption," Clara said. "And it's your chance to be the governor who stood up for common people before this became a scandal." She held his gaze. "You're up for re-election. How does it play when stories spread about farmers losing their land while the governor's office protected the people stealing it?" Crane's expression didn't change, but something moved behind it. "That sounds like a threat," he said. "It's political reality," Clara replied. "We're not asking for charity. We're offering you the chance to be on the right side of this before you're forced to be." A long silence. Crane stood and moved to the window, looking out at the capital's busy streets, commerce, and noise, and the specific energy of a place that had not yet been touched. by the particular grief of Redstone Valley. If I do this, he said, Irongate will fight hard. Every legal tool they have, every political favor they're owed. Let them fight, Eli said. Let it be messy. Justice usually is. Crane turned back. Something had crystallized in his expression, the look of a man who has stopped weighing and started deciding. I'll authorize a preliminary investigation, he said. Independent counsel, territorial jurisdiction authority to subpoena Irongate's records. I'll also send a territorial marshal to your property immediately. He looked at Eli directly. She'll be protected. Eli felt relief hit him so hard his vision swam for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is politics and law, slow, complicated, and uncertain. Crane extended his hand. But it's a start. Eli shook it and felt for the first time since this had started the weight of actual power on his side. They left the governor's office in a stunned and silent state, neither of them speaking until the street noise swallowed them up. Clara stopped on the steps. We did it, she said as if testing the words. We did it, Eli agreed. Now we ride back. They pushed the horses hard on the return, sleeping in short shifts, cutting every corner the road would allow. On the sixth day, they came over the ridge above Eli's land as evening light turned everything copper and amber. Eli saw the fence first. All 70 yards of it, not just the sections they'd completed in the desperate nighttime work, not just the road-facing portion they'd rushed through before dawn, but the entire boundary line. Complete. Standing. Each post-driven level, each wire strand pulled taut, the whole thing gleaming faintly in the evening light like something new. And standing in front of it, hammer in hand, was May. She wasn't alone. 20 people surrounded her, Tom Breslin from 2 farms over, Mrs. Chen from town, who had said she couldn't afford to help a woman Eli recognized from the saloon men he knew by sight, and men he'd never seen before. They were finishing the last section as Eli and Clara rode down the slope, driving the final posts with the communal rhythm of people who have chosen to do something together. May looked up. Her face broke into a smile that made the 6 days feel like a dream he was waking from. You're back, she called, and you're alive. Eli dismounted and crossed to her without thinking about whether it was the right thing to do or what it looked like. He just went. What is all this, he said. May looked at the workers around them, her expression something between proud and sheepish. Whitmore's men came the night you left, she said. 4 of them. I hid in the root cellar like I promised. They burned 2 sections of fence and rode away. She gestured at the rebuilt line. Tom Breslin showed up the next morning with timber and said burning fences was a poor use of Irongate's money if people just kept building them back. She paused. Others heard, came with wire tools food. Mrs. Chen brought enough to feed everyone working. She looked at Eli steadily. The marshal arrived before Whitmore could come back, arrested 2 of the men he'd left watching the property. The rest ran. Clara had dismounted and was standing beside Eli looking at the fence with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Something open and unguarded the spine of her undone for just a moment. You promised to run, Clara said to May. I promised to run if it got serious. 4 men and a fence fire is not serious. The root cellar is perfectly comfortable. May looked at her sister. Besides, I had help coming. Eli turned to the workers who had stopped to listen. Tom Breslin stood at the front, arms crossed, a slight smile on his weathered face. Around him, 20 people waited with the expectant quiet of people who have done something they aren't quite sure about yet and are waiting to find out how it turns out. The governor's launching an investigation, Eli said. Independent counsel, territorial jurisdiction. They have authority to subpoena Irongate's records. He let that settle. And he suspended all foreclosures in Redstone Valley pending the investigation's outcome. Nobody loses their land while this is pending. For a moment, nothing. Then Tom Breslin laughed, short and genuine and a little disbelieving. And the silence broke like ice on a river in spring, and 20 people started talking at once, and some of them were crying, and some of them were gripping each other's arms, and the sound of it rose into the evening air, like something that had been trapped underground for 3 years, finally finding its way out. Eli stood in the center of it and felt something shift in him, some last locked room opening. Not victory, not yet. The investigation would take months. Irongate would fight every inch. Nothing was certain, and probably nothing would ever be clean. But this moment right now, with 20 people who had chosen to stand, and a fence that kept getting rebuilt, and a governor who had chosen to look, this moment was real. Clara peered at his shoulder. You did this, she said quietly. We did this. She shook her head slightly. You refused to quit when quitting made sense. That's where this started. She looked out at the crowd, the fence, the valley going golden in the evening light. We just helped it grow. May found his other side. Her hand found his, and she held it for a moment, warm and certain, the way you hold something you've decided is worth holding. So what happens now? She asked. Eli looked at the fence, at the land, at the two women who had walked into his life from the dark and refused to walk back out of it. Now we rebuild it, he said, and we do it together. The celebration went on until the first stars appeared, and somewhere in the eastern distance, thunder rolled. Not dry thunder this time, real thunder, the kind that meant something. Part 4. The rain came in the night, not the dry thunder that had been mocking the valley for 3 years, tasting the idea of water and then taking it back. Real rain. The kind that meant it, that fell without apology and soaked into the dust, like the earth was remembering something it had forgotten. Eli woke to the sound of it on the roof and lay still for a long time, listening, not quite trusting it. He'd been lied to by the sky before, but it kept falling. By the time gray light was coming through the window, puddles had formed in the yard, small ones tentative but there. The drought-cracked ground was dark with it. Everywhere the rain touched, the world looked like it was taking a breath. Clara heard him up and came into the kitchen, pulling her hair back, expression measuring the new light outside with professional suspicion. Still going, she said. Yeah. How long's it been? 4 hours at least. She poured what remained of last night's coffee, cold thick, the color of trouble, and drank it without comment. May appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the old quilt from the wall, still half asleep, and stopped when she saw the yard. Is that? She started. Yes, Eli said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said the obvious thing, because saying it would have made it too real, and neither of them was ready for that yet. Clara set down her cup. We've got work to do. Storm or no storm. She was right, and the rain wasn't going to do it for them. The days that followed had the strange doubled quality of things that are simultaneously hopeful and precarious. The investigation was real. Governor Crane had been as good as his word, and a territorial council had arrived in Redstone Valley within 2 weeks, setting up an office in the old courthouse and beginning the slow, methodical work of subpoenaing Irongate's records. The foreclosure suspension held. No one in the valley lost their land while the council reviewed its cases. But Irongate was not idle. They worked their remaining levers with the efficiency of an organization that had been operating this way for years and had prepared contingencies for exactly this kind of interference. Merchants who had extended credit to valley farmers found that credit quietly called in. Shipments that were supposed to arrive were delayed by paperwork that seemed to generate itself. Small acts of inconvenience, none of them technically illegal, none of them individually worth making a formal complaint about, but cumulative grinding designed to make everyone who had stood at Eli's fence line understand that cooperation with the investigation came at a cost. Whitmore himself had retreated, not disappeared, but retreated. He was still in the valley, still visible, at the edge of town, still making his presence known. He had the patience of a man who had seen investigations come and go and knew that the world had a way of coming back around to what it was before. Eli knew it too. The barn roof needed repairs before the rain became a liability rather than a gift. The south field had to be cleared of dead growth before anything new could be planted. The creek, impossibly tentatively, was showing signs of a trickle at its farthest upstream point, a ghost of what it had been, and Eli spent 2 days digging and clearing debris from the channel in the hope of coaxing it further. All of this was necessary. All of it was urgent, and all of it took time away from the legal fight, which was itself demanding and constant. Clara had taken over the documentation work with characteristic efficiency, spending her evenings at the kitchen table cross-referencing May's original lists with the testimonies that had come in from neighboring landowners. People who hadn't been willing to speak openly at the fence had found in the weeks since the investigation started that they were willing to file quiet statements to let their numbers be counted, if not their names attached. The pattern she was building was damning dates, amounts, timeline violations, the same Irongate representatives appearing in case after case across multiple counties. May managed everything else. The food, the correspondence, the careful maintenance of relationships with the people who had stood at the fence and were now quietly wondering whether they'd made the right choice. She moved through the valley on horseback every few days, checking in, bringing news, making sure people understood that the investigation was progressing and that their presence still mattered. She was better at this than either Eli or Clara, carrying the right combination of gentleness and steadiness that made people feel both cared for and capable. The three of them had found, without planning it, a division of effort that worked in the way that things work when they've organized themselves around actual natures rather than assigned roles. But the investigation was slow, and Irongate's lawyers were very good. "They're going to try to get the record sealed," Clara said one evening, 3 weeks after the counsel had arrived. She was at the table with the documentation spread around her, a lamp burning low, the sound of rain still coming from outside the drought. Drought was not over, but the rain had come 3 times now, which meant something. "They'll claim the internal records constitute proprietary business information and request a protective order. If the council grants it, they won't," May said. "Governor Crane specifically authorized subpoena powers. A protective order would require him to walk that back. Unless Irongate finds something to offer him that's more valuable than whatever we're threatening." Eli looked up from the account ledger he'd been trying to make sense of. "Is that a risk?" "It's always a risk," Clara said. "That's politics. Crane made a calculation in that office that we were worth backing. If the calculation changes, then we give him reasons for it not to change," May said. She said it simply the way she said most things, but it had the weight of actual strategy. Eli looked at her. "The newspapers," she continued. "We've talked about it. We haven't done it." "We were waiting for the investigation to develop," Eli said. "We've waited long enough. If the story breaks now, with the investigation already underway, with the suspension of foreclosures already a fact, it becomes validation rather than accusation. We're not claiming something happened. We're reporting something that's already being officially investigated." She looked at Clara. "That's a different story to print. And it makes it much harder for Crane to reverse course because now there's public attention." Clara was quiet for a moment, running the angles. Then, "She's right. We write to the territorial papers. Frame it as the investigation itself, not our grievance, not one farmer's story, but the broader pattern. 47 families. 3 years. One company." "Selleck," Eli said suddenly. Both sisters looked at him. "He called it legal theft." "Those were his words. He's a former judge who was part of the process and walked away from it." Eli set down the ledger. "If he's willing to go on record—" "He won't," Clara said. "Maybe, but we should ask." Eli looked at her. "He warned us, Clara, multiple times. Warned us when he didn't have to. A man who just follows orders doesn't do that. There's a conscience there somewhere that isn't fully at peace with what Irongate made him do." Clara considered this for a long moment. Outside, the rain tapped against the window with the patient persistence of something that had all the time in the world. "All right," she said. "We ask." They found Selleck the next morning at the edge of town, sitting outside the livery stable with the look of a man who had nowhere particular to be and wasn't making peace with that. He watched them approach without moving, without changing expression, his old judge's face giving nothing away. "Hargrove," he said. "Miss Voss." A pause. "Both of you." "We need to talk," Eli said. "I figured that's why you're here." He gestured at the bench beside him, an old thing warped and bleached by years of sun. "Sit or don't as you like." Eli sat. Clara remained standing, but back enough that she wasn't crowding. May sat beside Eli. "The investigation's moving slowly," Eli said. "Investigations always move slowly. That's what they're for. If they moved fast, they couldn't be thorough." Selleck's voice was the same dry, measured instrument it had always been. "You're worried Irongate will find a way to narrow its scope before it gets to the worst of it, aren't you?" A long pause. "Yes." "Then help us," May said. Selleck looked at her properly, the way he'd avoided doing at the fence, like he was allowing himself to see something he'd been keeping in his peripheral vision. "Miss Voss, what you're asking would end whatever remains of my career in this territory." "Your career in this territory ended when you got relieved of your position," Clara said from behind them. "Not unkind, just factual. What's left is your reputation, and right now your reputation is whatever Irongate decides to say about you, because you have no platform of your own. Unless you do." "I was following legal procedure," Selleck said. "You were following orders dressed in legal procedure," May replied very gently. "You said so yourself. You called it legal theft, on the record to Eli's face in front of witnesses." She leaned slightly forward. A man who believed in what he was doing doesn't say that. Silence. The livery stable behind them breathed and shifted with the movement of horses. What exactly are you asking? Selleck said finally. A statement, Eli said, on record, that the foreclosure process in my case, and by extension in the other cases Irongate ran through the same channels, was procedurally irregular, that the timelines were manufactured, that the intent was not legal debt collection, but strategic acquisition. He held the old judge's gaze. You don't have to say anything you don't believe is true. Just say what you know. Another silence. Longer this time. If I do this, Selleck said, Irongate will deny it. They'll have their own lawyers, their own documents, their own version of every event. It'll be my word against theirs. It'll be a former circuit court judge's word against a land company's lawyers, Clara said. Those aren't equivalent weights. Selleck looked at her for a moment. Then unexpectedly, he almost smiled, the brief, wintry expression of a man rediscovering something he'd thought he'd lost. You're very good at this, he said. I've had practice, Clara replied. He stood slowly with the care of a man whose bones had opinions about weather. Give me 24 hours, he said. I need to think about how I say what needs saying. The words matter. They do, May said. We know. He walked back toward the center of town without looking back. They watched him go. He'll do it, May said quietly. You think so? Eli asked. I know that look. He's not deciding whether to do it. He's figuring out how to live with doing it. She turned back toward the horses. That's a different calculation. She was right as it turned out. Selleck's written statement arrived at the Territorial Council's office 2 days later, 3 pages in careful longhand, each detail placed with the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring words and wanted these ones to count. He laid out systematically and without melodrama the ways in which the Irongate foreclosure procedures had departed from proper legal process. The manufactured urgency, the debts transferred without adequate notice, the use of intimidation before any formal legal proceedings had concluded. He named names, he cited dates, he referenced case numbers. The statement hit the council's proceedings like a stone into still water. By the same evening, word had spread to the territorial newspaper office. Clara had already made sure of that. The story ran 3 days later. Not the small interior page item that might have been buried and ignored, but front page with Selleck's name attached and Eli's documentation referenced in the 47 case numbers printed in a column that made them look like what they were, a record of systematic theft. Irongate's lawyers filed a response the same day, then another the day after. Then a motion to dismiss the council's authority entirely based on a technical argument about the governor's jurisdiction over private contracts. Governor Crane denied the motion. Irongate appealed. The fight moved into its legal phase, which was slower and quieter than the confrontations at the fence, but no less consequential. Eli hired a lawyer from the Capitol, a young woman named Prentice, who had made a name for herself representing small landowners in mineral rights disputes, and who approached the Irongate case with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of fight. She was sharp and thorough and absolutely unimpressed by Irongate's resources, which she had seen before and had theories about. They've been doing this for years, she told Eli at the kitchen table, spreading her own set of documents alongside May's. Across 4 counties. The pattern predates the drought by at least 2 years. The drought just accelerated their timeline because it produced so many defaulting notes. They weren't opportunists, they were positioned. Meaning what? Meaning they knew the drought was coming before anyone else did, or at least suspected it. Their acquisition strategy in this valley started roughly 8 months before the first significant rainfall deficit. She tapped a document. I want to find out who gave them that information and what they paid for it. That was a bigger story than even they had imagined. It unfolded slowly over the following weeks, pieces of it emerging through the council's subpoenas, other pieces surfacing through Prentice's independent investigation, all of it cohering into something darker and more premeditated than simple opportunism. Irongate had had a contact within the Territorial Agricultural Survey Office, someone who had seen the drought coming in the data, soil moisture readings, aquifer levels, precipitation, trends, and passed that information quietly to Irongate's leadership. Irongate had spent the year before the drought quietly purchasing debt instruments from small valley banks positioning themselves to call those debts at exactly the moment the drought made it impossible to pay them. When Eli told Clara and May what Prentice had found, they sat with it in silence for a while. So it wasn't just opportunism, May said finally. Planned, Clara said, from the start. Almost certainly. Eli looked at his hands at the scars and calluses that were the biography of 3 years of fighting to hold on. Someone in the government helped them. Someone who knew what was coming and chose who would survive it. May was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain was at it again, the fourth time in as many weeks. The creek behind the house was running now, a thin, persistent thread of it, cold and real. The low fields were still dead, but there was something in the soil that hadn't been there before, something waiting. What happens now, she asked. Now Prentice takes everything to the council, Eli said, and the council decides whether there's criminal exposure, not just civil liability. He paused. That's a different proceeding, different stakes. Criminal charges, Clara said, against Irongate's leadership. Possibly, if they can establish the government contact and prove it was corrupt. He exhaled. It's still months away, maybe longer, and Irongate will fight every step. But they're fighting defensively now, May said. Not offensively. That matters. It did. The dynamic had shifted in the weeks since the investigation began, where Irongate had been pressing, pushing, applying pressure from a position of apparent inevitability. They were now retreating behind legal arguments, buying time rather than taking territory. The aggressive timeline, the armed visits, the fence burning, all of that had stopped. Not because they'd given up, but because the visibility had changed the cost-benefit calculation. When everything was being watched, the methods that worked in darkness became liabilities. Eli went to check the fence every morning. Not out of fear that it would fall. It stood solid, the strongest section of fence line on the property driven into the earth by more hands than he could count. He went because it had become something to him that he didn't fully have words for. A marker. The place where things had changed, the boundary between what had almost happened and what was actually happening instead. One morning, 2 months into the investigation, he was walking the fence line in the early light when he heard footsteps behind him. He knew them without turning. "You're up early," May said. "Couldn't sleep." He kept his eyes on the fence, thinking about Prentice's report, about what they're going to find when they dig into the survey office connection. It'll be what it is. May walked beside him, matching his pace without comment on the hour or the cold. "You can't think your way to a different outcome." "I know." He paused at the corner post, the one he'd driven himself on the first night before any of this had started. The wood was weathered already, beginning to show its age. "I keep thinking about what it was like working on this fence that first night, before you came. I was absolutely certain I was doing the last thing I was going to do, the final act before the ending. And now?" He looked out across the valley, the brown of the fields, but with patches of green beginning, tentative and small but real. The creek catching the morning light. The other farms visible in the distance, lights on in windows, smoke from chimneys. "Now I'm thinking about what comes after," he said. "What we build when this is finished. Whether the land can come back. How long it takes." He turned to look at May. "What we do with all of this, all three of us, once there's no more crisis to fight through." She looked back at him with those quiet eyes that saw things and didn't pretend not to. "That's the right question," she said, finally. He wasn't sure what he meant to do next. He wasn't entirely certain what his intentions were, or what hers were, or whether this moment was the right one for any of the things that had been accumulating between them since the night they'd first stood at a broken fence in the dark. What he knew was that she was here, and had been here, and had chosen to keep being here through things that should have driven her away. What he knew was that she'd held a lantern for him when he was working in the dark and hadn't required anything in return. What he knew was that somewhere between the fence and the governor's office and the slow turning of the investigation, the boundaries between neighbor and partner, and something more had quietly dissolved, and he hadn't been the one to notice it first. She had. He was fairly certain she had. "May," he said. "Eli," she said at the same moment. They both stopped. Then she laughed, a short, surprised sound, and he found himself laughing too, the specific release of tension that happens when two people realize they've been carrying the same thing and finally put it down in the same place at the same time. "You first," she said. "I was going to say he started." Clara's voice came from the direction of the house, cutting through the morning air with characteristic efficiency. Prentice is here. She rode through the night. Says it's important. They both turned. Clara was standing in the yard, and behind her, still on horseback, was a figure in a travel-dusty coat with the posture of someone who had not slept and had news that wouldn't wait. May looked at Eli. Something passed between them. Acknowledgement, postponement, the understanding that whatever they'd been about to say would still be there when this was done. "Come on," she said, and started toward the house. Eli followed. Prentice dismounted as they came across the yard, her expression carrying the particular energy of someone who has found what they were looking for and isn't sure yet whether it's a gift or a weapon. "They found the contact," she said without preamble. "The agricultural survey officer. He's already talking. Apparently, Irongate's lawyers reached out to him 2 days ago to remind him of what he'd done, which had the opposite of the intended effect." "He's testifying?" Clara asked. "He's already testified, sealed deposition, but the council has it, and it's not just the drought data. He handed them a ledger." Prentice looked at them each in turn. 3 years of payments, names, amounts, dates, their operations across 4 counties, every land agent, every foreman, every purchased debt instrument. She paused. "Including Cole Whitmore, including Dutch Fenn, including 2 members of the territorial legislature who've been smoothing Irongate's path through the legal system." The yard went quiet. The rain had stopped in the night, and the morning air was clear and washed clean, and somewhere in the near pasture a bird was doing something optimistic. "It's over," May said softly. "The criminal portion is just beginning," Prentice said carefully. "But Irongate as a functioning operation in this territory? Yes, when this ledger becomes part of the public record." She paused. "They won't survive it." Eli stood in the yard of his father's farm and let that settle through him, not as triumph, because triumph had never been the right word for what he'd been fighting for. Something quieter. Something that felt less like winning and more like the ending of a long wrong. "The 47 families," he said. "The council is already preparing a restitution framework," Prentice said. "It'll take time. The legal process always does. But the land transfers will be reviewed. Properties acquired through a regular process will be returned or compensated." She looked at him directly. "Including this one, which was never properly transferred at all." "It was always his," Clara said quietly. "Legally, yes. Now it'll be provably so." Prentice folded her coat across her arm. "I need to get to the council office before the morning session. But I wanted you to hear it first." She rode away through the gate, back down the road that had brought Whitmore and Selleck, and all of it back toward the town that had once seemed like it was going to watch everything fall. Eli, May, and Clara stood in the yard and watched her go. After a while, Clara said, "I suppose this means we have to figure out what comes next." "We do," May agreed. They both looked at Eli. He looked back at them, these 2 women, who had arrived in the dark with nothing and somehow become the thing that made everything possible. These 2 sisters who were so different in every visible way and so identical in the ones that mattered. This strange family that had assembled itself in the worst possible circumstances and decided to stay that way. "Same thing we've been doing it," he said. "We rebuild. Together." Clara raised an eyebrow. "That's your plan? We rebuild together after everything." "That's my plan." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring, calculating, arriving at some conclusion that appeared to satisfy her requirements. "Fine," she said with the air of someone granting a significant concession. "But I'm fixing the barn roof first. The northeast corner is going to collapse if someone doesn't address it." "The northeast corner is fine," Eli said. "The northeast corner is one good rain from catastrophe. I've been watching it for 3 weeks." She was already moving toward the barn. "May, tell him I'm right about the barn." "She's right about the barn," May said. "I'm right about most things," Clara called back without turning around. Eli looked at May. She was smiling, the quiet kind, the one that meant something she didn't feel the need to say out loud. He thought about what he'd been about to tell her at the fence and the way she'd said his name at the same moment, and decided that some things could wait for the right moment and some things couldn't wait for much longer. "About what I was going to say earlier," he started. "I know," May said. "You know, I've known for a while." She looked up at him with the clarity that was the most distinctly hers of all her qualities. "I've been waiting for you to catch up." He stood there for a moment, feeling slightly outmaneuvered in the best possible way. "How long?" he asked. "The second night," she said, "at the fence. When you said it was yours, and you'd be damned before you'd let them take it without making them fight for every inch." She tilted her head slightly. You were talking about the land, but I wasn't thinking about the land. Eli looked at her. The morning light was full and clear, and making everything look like it was worth keeping. May Voss, he said. Eli Hargrove, she said back. From the barn, Clara's voice. If the two of you are having a moment, could you have it after someone helps me with this roof beam? Because it is genuinely a safety issue. May laughed. Eli laughed. And they walked across the yard together toward whatever came next. Part 5. The Territorial Council's public hearing was set for a Thursday in October, 6 months after Eli Hargrove had torn a foreclosure order in half in front of 27 witnesses and changed the shape of what was possible. It was a clear morning, the clarity that comes after the first real cold of autumn, the kind that makes everything look like it's been cleaned and put back in its correct position. Eli stood at the kitchen window and watched the frost on the near pasture catch the early light thin and silver melting already as the sun climbed. The creek was running, not the trickle he'd first coaxed from the upstream channel back in the summer, not the tentative thread of it that had given him something to hope for a real creek moving, with actual intention carrying water the way it was supposed to. The rains had come 4 more times since July. The valley hadn't recovered, drought damage ran too deep, and had lasted too long for a single season to undo it. But it was recovering. The distinction mattered. Eli turned from the window at the sound of footsteps. Clara appeared first. She always appeared first, already dressed and carrying a coffee cup and a sheaf of documents, because Clara's approach to significant days was to treat them like any other day and do them better. Behind her, May came in wrapped in a shawl, her hair done looking at the frost through the same window Eli had just left. You should eat, May said, not looking at him. You sound like you've said that before. I've said it 17 times. You've listened 4 of those times. Today should be number 5. She moved to the stove. This is not a day to have poor judgment from hunger. Clara spread her documents across the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing complex information for months and was comfortable in that work now. Prentice will meet us at the courthouse at 9. The hearing starts at 10. The council has Selleck's statement, the ledger, the deposition, and our documentation. She looked up. Irongate's lawyers have filed 12 objections in the last 2 weeks. The council has overruled 11 of them. And the 12th, Eli asked? Still pending. Something about the chain of custody for 2 pages of the ledger. Clara's expression said exactly what she thought about the 12th objection. Prentice says it won't matter. The ledger is corroborated by enough independent evidence that those 2 pages aren't load-bearing. Eli sat down and accepted the plate May set in front of him. The hearing had been a long time coming. The ledger discovery had accelerated the council's timeline. Significantly hard evidence of systematic corruption was a different thing from patterns of suspicious behavior, and the council had moved with more purpose once they had something concrete to point to. The 2 members of the territorial legislature whose names had appeared in the ledger had resigned within a week of Prentice filing her brief. Dutch Fenn had quietly left the valley. Word was he'd been seen heading east, though no one knew to where. The agricultural survey officer's sealed deposition had been confirmed and entered into evidence. Cole Whitmore was still in the valley. That surprised Eli, but Prentice said it shouldn't. Men like Whitmore, she explained, tended to believe that their specific position insulated them from consequences, even when the organization around them collapsed. He'd been visible at the edge of town for weeks, watching, calculating, apparently still waiting for something to change in Irongate's favor. Whatever he was waiting for had not arrived. Whitmore, Eli said. Will be at the hearing, Clara said. Irongate's counsel is still his counsel. He has to be there. I know. Eli looked at his plate. I'm not worried about him. You should be a little worried about him, Clara said. Men who've lost their institutional backing have a tendency to make poor decisions when they feel cornered. She's right, May said from the stove. She usually is. Eli agreed, which earned him a brief, satisfied glance from Clara and a smile from May. This was their ordinary now, the 3 of them at the table, the day's work organized and distributed, the particular comfort of a household that had figured out how to function as a unit. The barn roof had been repaired, the northeast corner, as well as 3 other spots Clara had identified in her systematic inspection of everything that needed attention. The south field was cleared and seeded too late in the season to yield much this year, but positioned for spring. The fences were all standing, not just the eastern boundary line, but the full perimeter rebuilt section by section over the summer, with help that had come and kept coming, neighbors who showed up with tools and labor and stayed for lunch and came back the following week. The community that had assembled itself at the fence in crisis had not dissolved when the crisis eased. It had changed shape, become quieter, more ordinary the way that good things often do when they stop being necessary and start just being real. Tom Breslin stopped by regularly. Mrs. Chen had organized something she called a Valley Cooperative, which was formally about shared equipment and informally about making sure no one fell too far behind alone. The investigation had given people something to point at, a shared story about what they'd been through and what they'd chosen, and shared stories turned out to be the kind of thing that held communities together even after the emergency had passed. Prentice was waiting outside the courthouse when they arrived, her coat collar up against the October chill, her expression carrying the particular focused energy she brought to important days. Around her, the street was already busy, not just with the usual morning traffic, but with people who had come specifically for the hearing. Eli recognized faces from the valley, from town, from the farms between them. Word had spread about what the council had found. People wanted to be present for the accounting. "How are you feeling?" Prentice asked Eli. "Ready," he said. "Good." She looked at Clara and May. "All three of you may be asked to give statements. Clara's documentation work will be entered directly. May, your witness list has been invaluable. The council's been using it as a reference throughout the investigation." She looked back at Eli. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to say. But if you do want to speak, this is your opportunity." "I'll speak," Eli said. The courthouse was old and smelled of old wood and old decisions. The council chamber was larger than Eli had expected, long benches arranged in a semicircle around a raised platform where the 5 council members sat with the contained attention of people who had spent months with a complicated problem and were now arriving at something definitive. Irongate's legal team occupied one side of the chamber. 6 lawyers in expensive coats, organized and expressionless, their documentation stacked in neat towers. Their composure was professional and almost convincing, except that Eli had been watching men like this for 7 months and had learned to read what composed men were composing themselves against. They were afraid. Not of losing the hearing that was already decided. Prentice had told him privately the council was not convening to deliberate but to announce. They were afraid of the specific shape that losing would take, of the names in the ledger and what exposure meant, of the fact that this had become visible in a way that couldn't be made invisible again. Cole Whitmore sat at the far end of their bench, separated from the lawyers by a studied distance that said he had not quite accepted that they were all in the same situation. He looked older than he had at the fence on that first night, not worn down exactly, but compressed like a man who has been carrying something heavy and is starting to feel the weight. He caught Eli's eye across the chamber. Eli held the look for a moment, not with hostility, not with triumph, just with the steady acknowledgement of someone who has looked at the same situation from very different angles and arrived at different conclusions and is not going to pretend otherwise. Then he looked away. The council chairwoman called the session to order with a clarity that cut through all the noise in the room. This council convened 6 months ago at the direction of Governor Aldous Crane to investigate allegations of systematic irregularity in the land acquisition practices of the Irongate Land Company within Redstone Valley in the 3 adjacent counties. She looked at the documents in front of her, then at the room. "We have completed that investigation. Today we announce our findings and the orders that follow from them." What followed was 2 hours of careful, methodical accounting. The council chairwoman moved through the evidence with the precision of someone who understood that the architecture of a finding matters as much as the finding itself, that each piece had to be placed correctly so that the whole held together against any challenge. The survey officer's information sharing with Irongate leadership beginning 30 months before the drought's worst year. The deliberate acquisition of debt instruments from Valley banks during that period. The coordinated timeline manipulation and foreclosure proceedings across 47 properties. The 2 legislative contacts and what they had been paid to smooth over. The intimidation tactics employed against landowners who resisted, including armed confrontations and deliberate property destruction. When the council chairwoman described the burning of the fence sections at Eli's property, she read it with the same even tone she'd used for the financial figures and the procedural violations, just another datum in a pattern. Eli sat with it quietly. Beside him, he felt Clara's stillness and beyond her maze. Irongate's lead attorney rose to present the response. He was good, experienced, and precise, finding every legitimate weak point in the council's evidence and pressing it with professional thoroughness. The chain of custody objection, the jurisdictional questions, the argument that some of the 47 foreclosures had been legally correct even if the broader strategy was problematic. He spoke for 40 minutes. When he sat down, the council chairwoman thanked him and looked at her colleagues. A brief, quiet exchange. Nothing dramatic, just 5 people confirming something they'd already agreed on. Then she read the orders. The Irongate Land Company's operating license in the territory was suspended pending criminal proceedings. All land transfers executed under the irregular process identified in the investigation were ordered reviewed with presumptive restoration to original owners subject to any legitimate debt obligations properly calculated according to correct procedure. Restitution mechanisms were established. Criminal referrals for Irongate's leadership were forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General. Cole Whitmore was named specifically as a subject of the criminal referral. He sat very still when his name was read. Eli watched him for a moment, watched the composed professional stillness compress further into something that was no longer really composure at all. Whatever Whitmore had been waiting for had not come. Whatever he'd believed would protect him had not held. There was nothing satisfying in watching it. Eli had expected to feel something vindication maybe, or at least the specific relief of a wrong acknowledged. What he actually felt was tired. The useful, completed kind of tired, not the desperate, exhausted kind he'd been carrying for years. The difference was everything. Prentice leaned close. "Your property deed is cleared as of today's order," she said quietly. "Officially, legally, permanently yours." "It was always mine," Eli said. "Yes," she said. "Now everyone else agrees." The chamber broke into noise as the session ended. Voices overlapping, people moving, the specific controlled chaos of a significant event releasing its held breath. Irongate's lawyers moved in efficient, grim-faced clusters. People from the valley found each other across the room and said things that probably needed to be said. The council members descended from their platform and were immediately surrounded. Eli stayed where he was for a moment. He thought about his father who had died in a field trying to dig water out of ground that had none left. He thought about his mother who had loved the land in the real and particular way with her hands in it, with her attention on it, with the unsentimental devotion of someone who understood that care wasn't sentiment, but practice. He thought about his brother, wherever California had taken him, and whether he'd ever wonder how things came out. Then he thought about 2 sisters who had appeared in the dark from nowhere and refused to leave. Clara appeared beside him. She didn't say anything which was unusual enough to be meaningful. "Clara," he said. "Hargrove. Thank you." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "Don't get sentimental. There's still a barn roof to monitor. The northeast corner is fine. 3 other spots. You've inspected it 17 times. I think you'd know." "That's why I know it's not fine." She paused. "You're welcome, Eli, for what it's worth." She said his name so rarely that it landing now meant something. "Though I'll remind you that you'd have found your way to this without us." "I wouldn't have." "You would have. Slower, less efficiently, with more near-death experiences." She tilted her head. "Maybe with the same result in the end. Maybe not. Hard to say." She looked across the chamber to where May was talking to Tom Breslin and 3 other people from the valley, her quiet attention making everyone around her visibly more settled. "She believes you would have. I believe May about most things. And you." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I think you needed someone to refuse to let you fail. And we needed someone worth refusing to let fail." She looked at him directly. "That's not a bad foundation." "No," Eli said, "it isn't." They found their way out of the courthouse into the October morning, the 3 of them coming together naturally in the street outside Eli, then May, then Clara. The ordering that had emerged without discussion over the months they had been figuring out how to be whatever they were to each other. Tom Breslin caught up with them on the steps. "So it's done?" he asked. "The hearing is done," Eli said. "The legal process goes on for a while, but yes, done enough." Breslin nodded, looking at the courthouse. Then he looked at Eli, a long, considering look from a man who had known the valley longer than most. "Your father would have called it a miracle," he said. "I call it about time." "I call it a lot of very long days," Clara said. "That too." Breslin touched the brim of his hat to May, who smiled back at him, then turned and walked back toward the other valley peeps he'd seen gathering in the street, already folding the morning into the ongoing conversation of a community that had remembered how to be one. They stood in the October light and let the morning settle around them. "What are you thinking?" May asked Eli. He thought about the fence on the first night. He thought about the lantern in the dark. He thought about tearing paper in the morning sun, while 27 people stood witness to something they'd decided together mattered. He thought about a governor's handshake and a judge's statement and a creek running where there had been nothing but cracked earth. "I'm thinking about spring," he said. May looked at him. Spring. The south field is seeded. If the rain keeps coming, if the creek keeps running, next spring might be the first real planting season in 4 years. He looked at the valley spread below the town, brown and recovering, scarred and beginning. "I want to see what it looks like when it comes back." Clara made a sound that was approximately adjacent to satisfied. "So we're staying." "We're staying," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "Obviously we're staying," Clara said. "I've been thinking about a second well. The location upstream from the current, one where the geology suggests there might be a decent aquifer." She was already moving, already planning her eyes on the middle distance where problems waited to be identified and solved. "May, will you look at the survey maps with me this afternoon?" "After lunch," May said. "After lunch," Clara agreed, walking ahead already somewhere in her own calculations. May watched her go with the expression she reserved for Clara, fond and exasperated, and deeply certain the expression of someone who has long since stopped trying to change what they love and started building their life around it instead. She turned back to Eli. "Spring," she said, trying it out. "Spring," he confirmed. He thought about what he'd been trying to say at the fence that morning, in October light instead of pre-dawn dark, and decided that he had said enough of it in pieces over the months, in the way they'd moved through the days together, in the particular care of the ordinary things in the fence line. They walked together in the early mornings now, without needing to explain why. Some things didn't require a complete sentence to be understood. Some things had already been said in every other way and just needed to be acknowledged. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked down the courthouse steps and into the October morning, toward the horses waiting at the post, toward the valley spreading out before them with its brown fields and running creek and 70 yards of strong fence along the eastern boundary, the boundary that had been a tombstone and was now something else entirely. Toward the work ahead, which was the right kind of work, not desperate maintenance of something failing, but deliberate building of something new. Claire was already at the horses, working through something in the survey maps she'd produced from somewhere. The morning sun made everything look clean and possible. The frost on the grass had melted completely. "Eli," May said as they reached the bottom of the steps. "Yes." "I'm glad you didn't give up." He looked at her and the woman who had held a lantern in the dark and asked him what the land had been before, who had understood that surviving and living were different things and had insisted on the difference, who had shown him that community was not something you found already assembled, but something you built out of whatever you had. "I'm glad you showed up," he said, "on that first night, in the dark." "We didn't have anywhere else to go," she said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and they both knew it. "Neither did I," he said, which was also true and also not the whole truth. She smiled, the quiet kind, the one that meant everything she didn't feel the need to say. They walked to the horses. Clara looked up from her maps. "Ready, Tom?" "Ready," Eli said. "The northeast corner of the barn." "Clara." "Fine, later." She folded the maps. "Let's go home." The road back to the valley was an hour's ride through October country. Bare hills, a sky that had forgotten how to be. Nothing but heat, the particular quality of light that belongs only to autumn in the high country where everything has earned its colors by enduring. They rode 3 abreast when the road allowed it, which Clara insisted it did more often than strictly necessary. They talked about the spring planting, about the second well location Clara had been considering, about whether the Valley Cooperative Mrs. Chen had organized would continue to hold, and how to make sure it did. About the smaller things, the repairs still needed, the records still to file, the neighbors still to check on in the weeks ahead. Ordinary things, the best kind. When they crested the final rise and the property appeared below them, the house, the barn, the fields, and along the eastern boundary, the fence standing solid and whole in the afternoon light, Eli stopped his horse without planning to. He sat there for a moment looking at it. The land was his. It had always been his, and now it was provably, legally, permanently so. It was still damaged, still recovering, still a long way from what it had been or what he hoped it would become. The drought had left marks that would take years to fully undo. There was no clean ending, no moment where the difficulty became completed, past tense. There was only the ongoing, the daily choosing the work that was never finished because it was the work of something alive. His father had died on this land certain it owed him a return on his investment. His mother had lived on it with her hands in it, knowing that the return was in the caring itself. He had spent 3 years trying to hold on to something he'd half given up on while telling himself the opposite. But then, but then two sisters had appeared in the dark and refused to leave. Clara reined up beside him. "Are you having a moment?" "Probably," he admitted. She looked at the property below, at the fence, at the small real evidence of recovery beginning in the fields. Something moved through her expression, some private accounting arrived at, and put away in the same instant. "Good," she said. "Have it quickly. The barn isn't going to fix itself." She rode down the slope. May came up beside him and waited. The afternoon light made everything look like the kind of thing worth fighting for. The creek caught it in pieces. The fence held it along its whole length solid and present. "Ready?" May asked. Eli took one more moment. Then he looked at her, at May Voss, who had held the light when everything was dark, who had asked him what the land used to be because she wanted to understand what they were fighting for, who had stayed when staying was dangerous and harder than leaving, and absolutely worth it. "Yes," he said. They rode down together. Clara was already at the barn, assessing the northeast corner, with the focused attention of someone who takes infrastructure personally. Tom Breslin had appeared from somewhere, as Tom Breslin tended to do, and was handing up tools with the easy comfort of someone who belonged. From the direction of the road, another rider was coming, someone Eli recognized as a neighbor from 3 farms over, probably with news from the hearing, or a question about the cooperative, or simply because the impulse to show up had become a habit in this part of the valley. The fence stood along the eastern boundary in the October light. The creek ran in its channel below the house, cold and real and going. In the south field, under the surface of the earth, seeds waited for spring. Eli Hargrove swung down from his horse, took off his hat, and looked at everything he had fought to keep. It looked like a beginning. It felt like one too. He put his hat back on and went to help Clara with the barn.